They said the farm had swallowed 3 owners and every dollar they brought with them. By the time Ethan Calloway turned off the county road and rolled through the broken front gate, even the sunset looked unwilling to stay. Rusted wire fences sagged like tired shoulders. The old barn leaned against the wind as if one more winter might finish the job. 40 acres of dead field stretched in every direction, pale and brittle beneath the October sky. And yet, for the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to quiet. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered by long seasons no one could see. His dark brown hair carried early streaks of silver at the temples, and the lines around his gray eyes had been carved by distance, duty, and nights that never fully ended. He had once built bridges for the army in places where roads vanished overnight. Now he owned a farm most men would not take for free. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat brushed in silver and cream. The dog's ears stood high as church steeples, catching sounds too small for human hearing. His amber eyes studied the property with the patience of an old soldier. Ethan cut the engine. Silence rushed in, thick and cold. "Home," he said quietly, though the word felt unfamiliar in his mouth. Ranger jumped down first, paws landing soft in the dust. The wind moved through the weeds with a dry whisper. Somewhere far off, loose metal tapped a slow, uneven rhythm. Ethan stepped from the truck and looked at what $900 had bought him, a farmhouse with cracked windows, a porch sinking on one side, and a barn whose paint had peeled away decades ago. People in town had laughed when he signed the papers. One man at the gas station nearly spilled his coffee. "That place ain't cursed," he had said. "It's offended." Ethan hadn't answered. Men who had seen enough rarely wasted words. He opened the truck bed and lifted down 2 canvas bags, a toolbox, and a folded army cot. Everything he owned fit in the back of a pickup. Ranger was already moving toward the barn, nose low, tail level, reading scents left by rain, wood rot, mice, and forgotten years. The farmhouse door groaned open after the 3rd shove. Inside, dust floated in the last strips of light like tiny drifting stars. The rooms were bare except for a cast-iron stove, a broken chair, and wallpaper curling from the walls like old letters no one had answered. Ethan set down his gear, then stood still long enough to hear the house settle around him. Old beams creaked. Wind slipped through a crack near the kitchen window. Somewhere outside, Ranger barked once. Sharp. Focused. Not fear. Ethan stepped back onto the porch. The dog stood at the barn entrance, body rigid, ears forward. Another bark came, lower this time. Then Ranger disappeared inside. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and crossed the yard as twilight deepened into blue. The barn smelled of hay long gone, cedar rot, and earth. Moonlight spilled through holes in the roof. Ranger stood in the center stall, pawing hard at the packed dirt floor. Dust rose around him in pale clouds. Ethan swept the beam downward and saw something no one had mentioned. Beneath the thin layer of soil, a clean line of metal gleamed. Ethan knelt beside the fresh scratches Ranger had carved into the packed floor and brushed the loose dirt away with his gloved hand. The beam of the flashlight caught a narrow strip of steel buried just beneath the surface, too straight and clean to be natural. It ran across the stall in a perfect line, disappearing under years of dust and hardened soil. Ranger let out a low sound from deep in his chest, then placed one paw beside the metal and looked back at Ethan as if waiting for him to understand. "All right, partner," Ethan said softly. "Let us see what you found." He returned to the truck and brought back a shovel, a pry bar, and an old lantern he trusted more than batteries. Night had settled fully now. The wind moved through the gaps in the barn walls with a hollow whistle, and every loose chain hanging from the rafters tapped now and then like distant clockwork. Ethan worked in steady silence, peeling back the earth one careful layer at a time. Years in the army had taught him patience. Rushing was how men missed details that mattered. Ranger circled once, then sat. At the stall entrance, watching the dark beyond the barn as faithfully as he watched Ethan. Within 20 minutes, the shape beneath the soil revealed itself. It was not a pipe or scrap metal. It was a square hatch, roughly 6 feet across, built from thick steel plate and framed in concrete. A rusted wheel handle sat in the center. Ethan wiped the grime away and stared. Someone had spent real money to hide this. He tested the handle. It did not move. He leaned harder. Nothing. Time and weather had locked it tight. He set the lantern on an overturned bucket and examined the hinges. Heavy duty. Industrial grade. Older than they looked. He had seen similar hardware on supply bunkers overseas, built to last through storms and forgetfulness alike. The thought sent a quiet chill through him. What kind of farm needed a buried steel hatch beneath a horse stall? Ranger suddenly stood and barked once toward the open barn door. Ethan turned. Headlights rolled slowly across the yard, cutting through the dark like pale knives. A pickup truck stopped near the house, engine idling rough. An older man stepped out wearing denim overalls and a canvas coat faded by decades of weather. He removed his cap, revealing white hair flattened by the wind. "Knew I would find you here," the man said. His voice was gravelly but not unkind. "Town said the dog was making enough noise to wake the county." Ethan rested one hand on the pry bar. "Can I help you?" The man glanced past him, saw the uncovered hatch, and went still in a way that said more than words could. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "I prayed nobody would ever open that." Ranger moved between Ethan and the stranger, ears high, body calm but ready. The man noticed the dog and nodded respectfully. "Name is Walter Boone. My father worked this land before the bank took it. If that door is what I think it is, son, then you did not buy a ruined farm." He looked at the hatch again, eyes reflecting lantern light and old memory. "You bought a secret folks tried hard to bury." The wind pressed against the barn walls. Somewhere under their boots, faint as a heartbeat, something metal answered with a single echoing knock. Some doors stay closed because people are afraid of what truth might cost. The old barn fell silent after the knock beneath the floor, as if the building itself were listening. Ethan held the lantern higher. Shadows climbed the beams and gathered in the rafters like dark birds. Walter Boone stepped closer to the hatch, then stopped a few feet away. His weathered face had the careful look of a man walking near memory. "I was 12 when my father brought me here the last time," he said. "Told me never to speak of what sat under this land." Ranger did not move from Ethan's side, but his ears tracked every sound. The dog trusted little and forgot nothing. Ethan rested the pry bar against his shoulder. "Then maybe tonight is when someone starts talking." Walter gave a tired half smile. "Fair enough." Wind slipped through the slats and stirred old hay into soft spirals. Outside, the truck engine ticked as it cooled. Inside, time felt slower. Back in the drought years, Walter began, when wells ran shallow and crops burned brown by July, this farm belonged to a man named Silas Mercer. Folks called him stubborn because he smiled while other men panicked. Said he was building something beneath the barn that would save the county. Walter shook his head gently. Most thought grief had touched his mind. Ethan knelt at the wheel handle again and brushed away more rust. "Did it?" "No," Walter said quietly. "But envy touched everyone else." He crouched beside the hatch and pointed to the concrete frame. "See those markings?" Ethan angled the lantern lower. Faint letters had been stamped into the edge, nearly erased by dirt and years. "M.C.R., Mercer County Reserve," Walter said. Silas built underground storage before anybody believed harvests could fail this bad. Grain, tools, water systems, seed vaults. Maybe more. Ethan looked up sharply. "Then why hide it?" Walter's eyes drifted toward the dark fields beyond the barn door. "Because hungry men can become foolish men. When word spread, people came wanting keys, deeds, control. Silas refused to hand it to speculators from the city. Said the place belonged to the future, not to greed. Ranger let out a low rumble, then turned toward the hatch. Another faint sound rose from below, metal settling or perhaps something shifting after a long sleep. Ethan felt the vibration through one knee. Not imagination. Real. Measured. Alive in its own mechanical way. He gripped the wheel handle with both hands and leaned. At first nothing happened. Then a groan rolled through the steel like thunder trapped underground. Rust cracked loose in orange flakes. Walter stepped back. Easy now. Ethan turned again, shoulders tightening with old discipline. The handle moved another inch. Cold air breathed upward through the seam, carrying the scent of earth, iron, and something unexpectedly clean, like cedar sealed away from time. Ranger stood so fast the lantern flame trembled. His tail lowered. His eyes fixed on the widening gap. Ethan paused. There is more down there than storage, isn't there? Walter swallowed and looked older than he had minutes before. My father said Silas hid one thing greater than grain. What thing? Walter met his eyes. Proof. Ethan stared at him. Before he could ask another question, the hatch shifted open half an inch more, and from the darkness below came the soft steady sound of water still running after all these years. Sometimes the deepest places are the ones that keep their promises the longest. Ethan widened the hatch another few inches until the old seal finally surrendered with a long tired groan. Cold air rose from below in a steady breath, carrying the scent of wet stone, cedar, and metal untouched by sun for decades. The sound of running water grew clearer now, soft and constant, like a creek speaking in another room. Ranger stepped forward, nose lifted, then paused at the edge. His ears tilted into the darkness. He was alert, but not afraid. Ethan trusted that more than any map. He lifted the lantern and angled its glow downward. Iron steps descended into shadow, disappearing after 10 feet. The walls were lined in poured concrete, smooth and deliberate. This had not been built in haste. It had been built to endure. Walter Boone removed his cap and held it against his chest. I never thought I would see it open, he murmured. My father said if the day came, it would be. Because the right man had nothing left to lose. Ethan gave him a brief glance. Then your father had a dramatic streak. Walter almost laughed, though emotion caught it halfway. Ethan tested the first step with his boot. Solid. He picked up the lantern in one hand and began the descent. Ranger followed so close their shadows merged against the wall. Walter came behind them slower, gripping the rail with hands shaped by farm work and age. The temperature dropped with every step. Above them, the barn became a square of moonlight shrinking into distance. Below them, the underground hum of water and machinery wrapped around the silence. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a chamber larger than Ethan expected, nearly the size of the barn itself. The lantern light moved across rows of shelves, wooden crates, hand tools hung in careful order, sealed jars, and metal bins labeled in faded paint. Wheat. Corn. Rye. Beans. Everything arranged with the calm logic of a man who believed tomorrow deserved preparation. A narrow channel of clear water ran through the center of the room, guided by stone and pipe into a holding cistern. Ethan crouched beside it and touched the surface. Cold and clean. Spring-fed, he said. Still flowing. Walter nodded. That spring dried up on every map 40 years ago. Ranger trotted ahead between the aisles, claws clicking softly on concrete. He stopped near a far wall where an old flywheel turned slowly by belt and pulley, powered by the water current. The machine still moved with patient grace, as if no one had ever left. It drove a generator no larger than a desk, and above it a single bulb flickered weak amber light. Ethan stared. This place has had power all this time. Not much, Walter said. But enough to keep hope from going dark. On a nearby workbench lay notebooks stacked neatly beneath a layer of dust. Ethan opened the first one. Inside were handwritten ledgers, diagrams, rainfall tables, seed rotations, and names. Hundreds of names. Families. Deliveries. Amounts given. Amounts owed marked paid in full. He turned more pages, reading in silence. Silas Mercer had fed people quietly while the county praised wealthier men in public. Walter's voice lowered. He saved folks who later denied he ever helped them. Ranger barked once from the back corner. Ethan raised the lantern and walked toward him. There, set into the concrete wall behind hanging tarps, stood a second steel door, smaller than the hatch above but far thicker. Across it, in clean engraved letters, were 3 words. Open when ready. Some messages are written for the future, and some futures arrive wearing work boots and carrying dust. Ethan stood before the second steel door while the weak amber bulb hummed overhead. Ranger sat beside him, eyes fixed on the handle, every muscle quiet and ready. Walter Boone remained a few steps back, hat still in his hands, as if he had entered a church built from concrete and memory. The engraved words caught the lantern light again. Open when ready. Ready for what? Ethan asked. Walter exhaled slowly. My father never knew. He only said Silas Mercer believed timing mattered more than treasure. Ethan ran his fingers across the metal. Unlike the hatch above, this door showed little rust. It had been protected from weather and time. A smaller wheel lock rested at chest height, polished smooth by no hand Ethan could imagine. He gripped it and turned. The mechanism moved at once, clean and precise, followed by a deep internal click. Ranger's ears rose sharply. The door eased inward with surprising grace, revealing a room no larger than a toolshed. Shelves lined the walls. A cedar desk stood in the center. On it sat an oilcloth bundle, a brass key, and a glass jar holding seeds the color of pale gold. The air smelled faintly of pine and paper. Ethan stepped inside as though crossing into another century. He lifted the bundle carefully and unfolded it. Inside was a leather journal, preserved almost perfectly. The first page bore neat handwriting in dark ink. If you are reading this, then hardship has visited the land again. Walter swallowed hard. That is his hand, he whispered. Ethan turned pages slowly while the lantern light warmed the edges. Silas Mercer had recorded weather patterns, soil chemistry, irrigation designs, and experiments with drought-resistant grain developed over 20 years. There were maps of underground water veins beneath neighboring farms, methods for restoring exhausted fields, and notes on crop rotation decades ahead of common practice. Ethan looked up. This is not a diary. No, Walter said softly. It is a future no one listened to. Ranger sniffed the cedar desk, then nudged a lower drawer with his nose. Ethan opened it. Inside lay deed copies, land contracts, and sealed envelopes labeled with family names still living in the county. Many had lost property generations ago through debt and failed harvests. Attached to each packet were receipts marked settled by S. Mercer. Ethan read in disbelief. He bought their debts and never collected. Walter's eyes filled with old sorrow. He kept families on their land without asking for praise. But powerful men said he was buying influence. They ruined him in town meetings and newspapers until he withdrew. Ethan set the papers down with care. Then this room is proof. Proof that kindness can be mistaken for ambition, Walter said. Ranger gave a sudden bark and pawed near the far shelf. Behind a row of jars sat a metal box with a combination dial. Ethan lifted it onto the desk. Heavy. Solid. A folded note was taped beneath it. He read aloud. For the one who arrives with an honest companion. Walter looked at Ranger and let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter. Seems the dog made the shortlist. Ethan unfolded the note fully. 4 numbers had been written beneath the sentence, followed by one final line. Use what helps others first. He entered the combination. The dial clicked. The lid rose an inch. Inside, under velvet darkened by time, lay stacks of bearer bonds, gold certificates, and one modern envelope added years later. Ethan opened the envelope first. It contained a bank statement showing an active trust worth more money than the entire county might imagine. Money can change a life, but truth can change a town. Ethan read the statement twice, then a third time beneath the trembling lantern glow. The trust remained active through a regional bank in Kansas City, protected by renewal clauses and managed for decades by attorneys who had followed private. Instructions. The balance listed was enough to restore every acre of the farm, rebuild half the county roads, and still leave room for generations. Walter Boone lowered himself onto a wooden crate as if his knees had forgotten how to hold surprise. Silas Mercer was ruined in public, he said quietly. And rich in patience. Ethan set the paper down with careful hands. Wealth had once seemed like a language spoken by other people. Now it sat on a cedar desk beside jars of seed and a dog who only cared whether his human was steady. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's leg, grounding the moment with warm simple loyalty. Inside the box lay more than money. There were certificates for farmland parcels across 3 counties, shares in grain cooperatives, and letters stamped each decade by trustees confirming the fund had grown through wise investments. On top of the final stack was a sealed envelope addressed not by name, but by character. To the one who chose work over comfort. Ethan broke the seal and unfolded a single page. If greed found this room, it would become a vault. If gratitude found it, it would become a well. Use it accordingly. No signature was needed. Walter wiped one eye and looked embarrassed to be seen doing it. He knew men better than weather, he said. Ethan turned toward the shelves of ledgers and maps. Then he did not leave treasure. He left instructions. They carried the documents back into the larger chamber and spread them across the workbench. The weak generator lamp glowed steadier now, as though awakened by purpose. Ethan studied irrigation diagrams that could revive dry fields across the county. There were plans for low-cost grain storage, cooperative mills, and soil recovery methods modern farms still struggled to manage. Silas had been decades ahead, then buried by prideful men who could not stand being outshined by kindness. Ranger suddenly trotted to the stairs and barked once. Headlights swept faintly through the hatch above. Another vehicle had entered the yard. Walter's expression tightened. Word travels faster than wind around here. Ethan slid the papers into neat stacks. Who knows about this place? Nobody knew for. Sure, Walter said. But folks knew stories. Stories attract the wrong kind of curiosity. Boots sounded above, then voices muffled by distance. Ethan recognized one from the gas station, the man who laughed when he bought the property. A second voice was smoother, practiced, carrying the confidence of someone used to signatures and handshakes. Walter went pale. That will be Dean Holloway. County Commissioner. His grandfather led the meetings that ran Mercer out. Ranger stood at the foot of the stairs, silent now, eyes bright as embers. Ethan felt an old calm settle over him, the kind that arrived when pressure did. He had seen storms before. Some wore uniforms. Some wore polished boots. He gathered the trust papers, placed them back in the metal box, and locked it. Then they came too late, he said. Above them, the hatch will began to turn. Dust sifted from the ceiling in thin silver lines. The old farm, quiet for 40 years, was about to hear new voices. Some men arrive with questions. Others arrive already believing they own the answers. The hatch above swung open with a scrape of metal and a wash of cold night air. Lantern light from below met truck headlights from above, throwing long shadows across the stairwell. Ethan stood beside the workbench with the locked box under one arm. Ranger remained at the bottom step, silent and watchful, his ears forward like drawn arrows. Two figures appeared at the opening. The first was broad and red-faced, the man from the gas station whose laughter had followed Ethan all afternoon. The second descended more carefully, polished boots finding each step with practiced caution. Dean Holloway wore a wool coat too expensive for a barn and a smile too smooth for midnight. "Well now," Dean said, glancing around the chamber. "Seems the old stories were true after all." Walter Boone stiffened. "You should not be here." Dean barely looked at him. "Walter, you have spent your life confusing memory with authority." He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, congratulations on your purchase. Remarkable find." Ethan said nothing. Silence had weight when used correctly. Dean continued walking the room, admiring shelves, ledgers, water channels, machinery. "This property may be yours on paper," he said, "but anything of historic or agricultural significance falls under county review. There are procedures." Ranger let out a low growl that stopped just short of impolite. Dean paused. "Fine dog. Better judge of character than most," Ethan replied. The broad man behind Dean snorted, then grew quiet when Ranger's eyes met his. Dean folded his hands. "I am here to help. Discoveries like this can become complicated. Tax liens, preservation claims, environmental assessments. Paperwork has a way of swallowing good fortune." Walter stepped forward. "Your grandfather helped bury Silas Mercer." Dean's pleasant expression tightened for the first time. "My grandfather served the county." "He served himself," Walter said. The underground generator hummed softly, and water moved through the stone channel with steady purpose. Ethan looked around the chamber built by a man who had trusted time more than applause. Then he set the lockbox on the desk and opened Silas Mercer's journal to a marked page. "You know what I see here?" he asked. Dean shrugged. "An opportunity." "That is the problem," Ethan said. He turned the journal so Walter could see. The page listed names of families saved from foreclosure, seed deliveries made in secret, and debts purchased then forgiven. Dean glanced at the handwriting and looked away quickly. Recognition flashed across his face before control returned. "Old records do not change ownership law," he said. Ethan nodded slowly. "No. But they change stories." Ranger climbed 2 steps and stood between the visitors and the room below. "Not threatening." "Certain." Dean studied the dog, then Ethan, measuring resistance. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. Ethan thought of the broken fields outside, the empty storefronts in town, the farmers who had sold tractors to pay water bills. He thought of buying a ruined place because it was the only thing left he could afford. "I want this county to receive what it was denied," he said. Dean smiled again, thinner now. "Idealism is expensive." Ethan rested one hand on the lockbox. "Good thing I found funding." The broad man muttered under his breath. Dean ignored him. "You will need permits, votes, boards, signatures." Walter straightened with surprising strength. "Then he will not stand alone." Above them, more headlights rolled into the yard. Doors slammed. Voices gathered in the wind. Neighbors had come, drawn by rumor, light, and the sound of something long buried beginning to wake. When truth climbs the stairs, it rarely climbs alone. The yard outside the barn filled with the glow of headlights and the murmur of voices carried by the wind. Ethan emerged from the hatch first with Ranger at his side and the lockbox in his hand. Behind him came Walter Boone, then Dean Holloway and the others, their polished certainty dulled by the smell of old earth and exposed history. Neighbors stood in coats and flannel shirts, hands in pockets, faces lit by truck beams and curiosity. Some had laughed at Ethan that afternoon. Now no one laughed. The October night had gone still enough to hear the loose chains inside the barn sway softly overhead. A woman near the gate spoke first. What is down there? Walter answered before anyone else could. The reason this county should have never gone hungry. A ripple moved through the crowd. Dean stepped forward, recovering his public smile. Folks, let us all remain calm. There are legal channels for matters like this. Historical assets must be reviewed properly. By who? Called an older farmer from the back. The same offices that never fixed our wells. Several heads nodded. Dean's smile thinned. Ethan set the lockbox on the hood of his truck and opened Silas Mercer's journal. The pages lifted in the breeze like wings. He read names aloud, one after another. Families still known in town. Deliveries of grain. Notes of debt forgiven. Water maps shared in secret. Tools lent with no charge. The more he read, the quieter the crowd became. A woman covered her mouth when she heard her grandfather's name. A man removed his cap when he heard his mother's. Stories long told one way began turning in the dark. Ranger moved among the gathered people, calm and deliberate, stopping beside those who seemed shaken most. He leaned once against the leg of the older farmer, who absent-mindedly rested a hand on the dog's back. Mercer helped my daddy, the man whispered. We were told he tried to steal our land. Walter's voice rose stronger than Ethan had yet heard it. He bought debts to save farms, then kept quiet while others took credit. Dean lifted both hands. Even if that were true, sentiment does not create authority. Ethan opened the lockbox. Gasps spread through the yard when they saw the certificates, bonds, and trust papers. He held up the modern statement. Authority can also come with funding. The crowd pressed closer. Dean's companion took one step forward, then stopped when Ranger placed himself between the man and the truck, not growling, simply immovable. Ethan continued, this trust was built to restore what was neglected. Water systems. Soil recovery. Equipment grants. Family farms. The woman by the gate asked, who controls it? Ethan looked down at the page inside the envelope, then read the final clause aloud. To the lawful owner of the Mercer property, provided resources are used first for community renewal. Every eye turned toward him. Even Dean Holloway lost his practiced ease. Ethan closed the box gently. I bought the land. But this was never meant to belong to one man. Wind moved through the dead fields beyond the barn, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. For a moment, the whole county seemed to hold its breath. Then the older farmer stepped forward and extended a rough hand. Tell us where to start. One by one, others joined him. Dean stood apart beneath the truck lights, watching something he could not manage begin without him. And in the eastern sky, just beyond the fields everyone had called finished, the first low clouds of a coming storm gathered heavy with water. Hope often begins as work at first light. By sunrise, the ruined farm no longer looked abandoned. Pickup trucks lined the dirt lane. Men brought shovels, post-hole diggers, chains, and thermoses of coffee. Women arrived with biscuits wrapped in towels, notebooks, and the kind of practical wisdom that keeps projects alive. Teenagers who had once called the place haunted now hauled lumber and cleared brush with eager shoulders. Ranger moved through it all like a foreman in fur, checking each group, pausing when someone needed direction, then trotting on. Ethan stood near the barn doors with Silas Mercer's map spread across the hood of his truck. The morning air smelled of cedar dust, diesel, and the promise of rain. Walter Boone tapped one yellowed page with a bent finger. Here, he said. Old Spring Line runs under the north field, then forks toward Miller Road. Ethan studied the markings. Precise elevations. Stone markers. Flow notes from 70 years ago. If this still holds, he said, half the dry wells east of town can run again. The older farmer from the night before, whose name was Roy Miller, removed his cap and stared at the page. My granddad dug for water there 3 summers straight. Walter nodded sadly. He was digging 10 yards too far south. A murmur passed through the group. Dean Holloway arrived just after 8 in a dark SUV, tires too clean for the lane. He stepped out carrying folders and confidence, though less of both than before. "I am issuing a temporary hold until county assessors can review liabilities," he announced. Nobody stopped working. Hammers rang. Chains rattled. Someone started a tractor that coughed twice before finding life. Dean raised his voice. "Did you hear me?" A woman carrying fence staples looked at him kindly. "We did. We are just busy." Laughter rolled through the yard, warm and unforced. Ethan walked over, calm as ever. "No one is disturbing evidence," he said. "We are repairing fences, clearing debris, and following water maps on private land." Dean opened one folder, then closed it again when Ranger sat beside Ethan and watched him without blinking. "This is not over," Dean said quietly. "Most worthwhile things are not," Ethan replied. By noon, a trenching crew borrowed from 2 neighboring farms had followed Mercer's markings to the north field. Dry grass bent in the wind as the machine carved a careful line through hard earth. People gathered along the edge, hats shading hopeful eyes. At 6 feet down, the operator stopped and climbed out. Metal had sounded against the bucket. Ethan jumped into the trench with a shovel and cleared the dirt by hand. Beneath the clay lay an old ceramic pipe wrapped in tar cloth, still intact. Walter covered his face for a moment. "Mercer, you stubborn miracle," he whispered. They connected a temporary pump and opened the line inch by inch. At first, nothing came. Then a cough of mud. Then a brown stream. Then clear water burst upward in a shining arc that caught the noon sun and scattered diamonds across the field. People cheered so loudly birds lifted from the fence rows. Roy Miller wept openly and did not care who saw. Children ran laughing through the spray. Ranger barked 3 sharp triumphant bursts and bounded circles around Ethan, who stood drenched and smiling in a way the town had not yet seen. Beyond the celebration, Dean Holloway remained beside his SUV, staring at water pouring from ground everyone had called finished. And for the first time in years, the county believed dry things could live again. Sometimes rain falls from the sky. Sometimes it rises from the courage of neighbors. 3 days after the water line opened, the farm moved with the rhythm of purpose. Fence posts stood straight again. The porch no longer sagged. Fresh boards replaced broken ones on the barn, and the old fields had been marked into sections for test planting according to Silas Mercer's notes. Ethan worked from dawn until the stars returned, sleeves rolled, hands blistered, face sunburned by honest hours. He spoke little, but people learned his silences were useful things. Ranger stayed near whichever task mattered most, appearing beside loose gates, wandering calves, tired children, or tools left in the rain. The county had begun to call him Supervisor Ranger. Laughter came easier now. Inside the underground chamber, Ethan and Walter sorted journals into stacks by subject. Soil recovery. Water routes. Seed trials. Cooperative lending. On the 4th afternoon, Ethan opened a ledger thinner than the others and found names listed beside small amounts of money. Beside many names was a second column marked returned with dates years later. "He lent cash too," Ethan said. Walter adjusted his glasses. "To keep folks from losing tractors, feed, medicine. Quiet help is still help." Ethan turned another page and stopped. One name had been underlined twice. Holloway Development Group. Amount advanced for emergency payroll and equipment. Repaid, never. Walter's jaw tightened. Dean's grandfather borrowed from Mercer to keep his own business alive. Ethan read the margin note in neat handwriting. "Ask me not to tell anyone. Pride is a thirsty thing." Outside, thunder rolled low across the fields. Workers looked up with smiles instead of worry. Rain no longer meant mud alone. It meant planting. Dean Holloway arrived before the storm broke, this time without folders. He stood at the barn entrance, coat damp with humidity, eyes drawn to the bustling property that had become something larger than ownership. "I need to speak with you," he said. Ethan closed the ledger and stepped outside. Ranger followed. Wind moved through the new fence lines and carried the scent of coming rain. Dean kept his voice low. "My grandfather made mistakes. Men did things differently then." "Some did," Ethan replied. "Some helped their neighbors." Dean looked away toward the road. "If those ledgers go public, my family name is finished." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "A name built on hiding deserves sunlight." Dean's shoulders lowered, not in defeat but exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" Ethan thought of every empty storefront in town, every dry field, every man too proud to ask for help. "Tell the truth at the county meeting tomorrow." "All of it." Dean gave a bitter laugh. "You ask more than money. That is because money is easier." Rain began in slow heavy drops, darkening the dust. Dean stood in it without moving. Then he nodded once and walked back to his SUV like a man carrying a heavier coat than the one on his shoulders. That evening the storm settled over the valley with long silver sheets of water. Children danced in puddles. Farmers set buckets beneath gutters out of old habit and new gratitude. Ethan stood on the porch beside Ranger and watched the fields drink deeply. Behind them, from the warm kitchen of a house that had nearly fallen down, came the sound of neighbors cooking supper together. Some places do not need miracles. They need one honest beginning. The truth does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it walks into a room, clears its throat, and asks to be heard. The county meeting filled every folding chair before noon. Farmers in work boots stood along the walls. Shop owners crowded the back. Retired teachers, mechanics, church ladies, teenagers, and men who had not attended a public meeting in 20 years all came because hope had become local news. Ethan sat near the side aisle in a clean denim shirt, Ranger stretched at his feet like a patient guard carved from fur and discipline. Walter Boone held a stack of copied ledger pages on his lap with both hands. Dean Holloway stood near the front table beside the commissioners, looking as if sleep had passed him by. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows, steady and kind. When the chairman called the room to order, voices settled into a hush that carried old tension with it. Dean was first to speak. He rose slowly, removed his glasses, and faced the crowd without the polished smile he had worn all his life. "My family benefited from a lie," he said. A murmur moved through the room. He continued before fear could stop him. "Years ago, Silas Mercer loaned money, grain, and equipment to families across this county, including mine. Instead of gratitude, powerful men spread stories that he was stealing land and manipulating debts. My grandfather was among them." Silence deepened. Some people looked down. Others stared straight ahead. Dean's voice grew rougher. "Those stories protected reputations, not truth. Records discovered this week confirm it." He stepped aside and nodded toward Ethan. No one had expected that. Ethan carried no speech in with him. He simply walked to the front, placed Mercer's journal and the copied maps on the table, and looked across faces worn by weather and years. "I did not come here to embarrass the dead," he said. "I came because dry wells do not care about old pride." A few smiles flickered through the room. This county was given tools to thrive. They were buried with one man's name. They do not need to stay buried. He explained the trust, the water plans, the soil recovery notes, and the requirement written into the inheritance that resources be used first for community renewal. Then he asked for one thing only. Create an open board made of farmers, teachers, tradespeople, and residents. No closed doors. No special favors. Let the town decide where help goes. The chairman glanced left and right, then at the packed room. Hands rose before he even called for them. Nearly every hand. Walter Boone wept quietly into his cap. Ranger lifted his head, sensing the shift in human hearts before words could describe it. By afternoon, volunteers were already signing lists in the hallway. Well repair teams. Grant committees. Seed distribution. Apprenticeship programs for young workers. The courthouse, once known mainly for taxes and complaints, sounded like a workshop. As people filed out, Dean approached Ethan near the steps outside. Rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and laid gold across the wet street. "I do not expect forgiveness," Dean said. Ethan clipped Ranger's leash and looked toward the road leading back to the farm. "Good," he replied. "Expect usefulness." Dean nodded once, almost relieved. On the drive home, Ranger rested his muzzle on the open truck window, ears catching the clean scent of earth after rain. Ethan passed fields already darker with moisture, store windows brighter with plans, and neighbors waving from porches. He had come to buy a place no one wanted. Instead, he had found a town ready to remember who it could be. Good ground does not ask where the seed came from. It only asks whether it is ready to grow. By spring, the county looked different from the road. Fields once pale and cracked now carried rows of winter wheat rising green and even. Fresh pipelines fed troughs and gardens. Empty storefronts on Main Street had paint on their windows again, not dust. A hardware store reopened with young clerks learning inventory from a retired owner who smiled more than he charged. The old diner added 2 breakfast booths and never seemed to close before dark. On the Mercer farm, the barn stood straight beneath a new metal roof that rang softly when rain passed over. The farmhouse porch had been rebuilt. Wide enough for rocking chairs, muddy boots, and neighbors who dropped by without needing a reason. Ethan preferred mornings before anyone arrived. He would step outside with coffee warming his hands while mist moved low across the pasture and Ranger trotted fence lines like a sentry inspecting peace. The dog had grown broader through the chest and calmer through the eyes, though he still barked sharply whenever Dean Holloway's SUV turned into the lane. Dean came often now, usually carrying paperwork and humility in equal measure. He worked without complaint, learning that apology sounds strongest when it swings a hammer. Walter Boone had become keeper of the underground records, cataloging every journal and map with the care of a librarian protecting scripture. Teenagers volunteered after school to scan pages, label seed jars, and hear stories they once would have mocked. Ethan used the trust as Silas Mercer intended. Small grants repaired wells, tractors, roofs, and feed systems. Scholarships sent local kids to study agronomy, welding, and water management with signed agreements to bring those skills home for at least 2 years. Pride, once the county's favorite crop, began giving way to cooperation. One Saturday afternoon, families gathered at the farm for the first community planting day. Pickup beds arrived loaded with tools, pies, folding tables, and children who ran faster than instructions. Ranger supervised every sandwich dropped to the grass and every game of tag that crossed his patrol route. Laughter moved through the property like wind through tall grain. Ethan stood near the edge of the north field with Roy Miller, watching volunteers place seed according to Mercer's rotation charts. "Never thought I would see this land alive again," Roy said. Ethan looked over the rows stretching toward the tree line. "Neither did I." Roy studied him a moment. "You planning to stay?" Ethan answered honestly. "I was not planning much of anything when I got here." Roy smiled. "That sounds like yes." Later that evening, after trucks rolled away and the last dishes were stacked inside, Ethan returned to the underground chamber alone. Ranger followed, nails clicking softly on the stairs. The generator still turned by water power, steady as breath. Ethan opened one of Mercer's final journals and found a page he had somehow missed. It contained no diagrams, no figures, no names. Only one sentence written in the same neat hand. "If the land heals them, let them heal the land." Ethan read it twice, then closed the book gently. He sat on a wooden crate while Ranger rested beside his boots. For years, he had measured life by what was lost. Jobs. Time. People. Pieces of himself left in places no map could help him revisit. Down there, beneath the farm everyone had called ruined, he finally understood another measure. What remains can still be enough. Above them, evening wind crossed the fields and moved through new wheat with the sound of distant applause. Some endings do not sound like doors closing. They sound like gates opening at dawn. Summer came full and generous to the county. Wheat rolled across the hills in long golden waves. Gardens behind small houses overflowed with tomatoes, beans, and sweet corn. The hardware store hired 2 more clerks. The diner added a lunch special named after Ranger, though the dog remained suspicious of vegetables. Trucks moved steadily along roads once quiet, carrying seed, lumber, and neighbors who had rediscovered reasons to visit one another. On the farm, mornings began before sunrise. Ethan would wake to the soft creak of the house settling and the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen timer he still forgot to turn off some nights. He would step onto the porch where the boards no longer sagged, where hanging baskets swayed in the breeze, where peace had become ordinary enough to trust. Ranger always waited at the top step, tail sweeping once against the railing, ready for inspection rounds. Together they crossed dew-wet grass while the sky brightened over fields planted with Mercer grain. The old barn now held tools, feed, and laughter instead of shadows. Children came on weekends to learn fencing, planting, and how to approach a working dog with respect. Ranger accepted their admiration with professional restraint unless someone carried bacon. Walter Boone spent 3 afternoons each week in the archive room below ground, cataloging journals that local colleges now requested copies of. He wore clean glasses and the expression of a man who had lived long enough to watch truth become useful. Dean Holloway still came every Thursday. He no longer arrived in polished shoes. He brought gloves, payroll forms for community projects, and a humility that fit better each month. Ethan never called them friends, but he no longer watched Dean the way men watch weather. One evening near harvest, the town gathered for the first county supper on the farm. Long tables stretched beside the barn under strings of warm lights. There was brisket, pies, casseroles, cornbread, jars of pickles, and enough stories to feed another 100 people. Music drifted from a fiddle near the porch. Children chased fireflies between hay bales. Older couples danced slowly on packed dirt that had once hidden secrets. Ethan stood apart for a moment at the fence line, hat in hand, looking over the scene. He had spent years believing he was a man built for leaving. Ranger came and leaned against his leg with familiar weight. "You did this," Walter said quietly as he joined them. Ethan shook his head. "No. I just bought broken land." Walter smiled toward the tables, the lights, the people. "Exactly." After dark, when dishes were stacked and engines faded down the road, Ethan walked to the north field with Ranger beside him. Crickets sang in the grass. A warm breeze moved through the grain with the hush of distant surf. He stopped where the water line first broke open months before. Above him, stars filled the wide country sky in numbers city people forget exist. He thought of the day he arrived with everything he owned in a truck bed and nothing steady inside him but the dog at his side. He thought of Silas Mercer writing instructions to strangers he would never meet. He thought of how kindness sometimes waits underground until someone stubborn enough digs for it. Ethan knelt and scratched Ranger behind the ears. The dog sighed with complete contentment and settled beside his boots. "Home," Ethan said again into the night. This time the word did not feel borrowed. It felt planted. And across the dark fields, where ruined ground had once been written off by everyone, the wind answered like something agreeing at last.